I do also have a problem with my voice because my voice is 88 years old, so. And I'm having a little problem with my hearing with water in the tube, so you'll have to bear with me. I know everyone has a story to tell, and this may be an unusual one, but it is one that hasn't been heard before. And this story happened many years ago. It is likely in stark contrast to today's standard of living. However, I think difficulties in life help to build character, and it makes one a stronger person. And so I'm not really a speaker, but I can read. Growing up in the Depression years, when I was born in 1931, the Depression was well on its way. My family was a farming family going back to the mid-1850s in Wisconsin. Our farm was 1 mile south of the village of Institute on what now is known as Country View Road. Many of the farms in the neighborhood were owned or mortgaged by the Federal Land Bank. Local banks didn't necessarily loan money to farmers, so the farm, with much hard work, provided a bare living. There never was much cash available, but at least farm people could feed their family. Things were harder in the cities where many people depended on the government to feed them. It was hard work on the farm, mostly physical. I don't remember any overweight farmers. I never thought we were poor, but our way of living was very frugal. And all our neighbors were in the same position. Some had more and some had less than our family did. As a child, I was happy and accepting things as they were. After all, I lived in a beautiful area with fields and woods to explore and enjoy, and I had a favorite dog who was always with me. He was a cow dog, and I was a cowgirl. In the summer, we walked through the woods, following the cow paths, taking cows to different pastures. I had many chores to do each day. I helped to carry in water after hand pumping the pails full for drinking, cooking, and washing clothes. It was my job to carry in wood for the cast iron cook stove and to keep the wood box filled. I helped in the kitchen, setting the table, getting in fresh milk each day as my dad milked cows by hand. I would take the milk pail to the pump and put it in a bucket of cold water to cool it immediately. When I was in 8th grade, age 14, we finally got electricity in the house, and we were able to have running water, as we called it. The first 18 years of my life, we had no bathroom in the house and no phone. It was kind of quiet. I loved the freedom I had during the summer months. I got to roam all over the outdoors, enjoying the sunshine, the clouds, the wind, and the rain. It was very precious. I loved it all, and it has to this day been a part of my soul. Every farm had its own orchards. I had my favorite trees, yellow transparent in the spring, summer apples that had no name, the crab and the snow apples in the fall. I loved climbing trees, and no one ever told me to be careful. That was a lesson one learned quickly. Most of the life's lessons on the farm were learned and not told. Because work on the farm was an important part of life, a strong work ethic was very early established. And because it had to be done, it was an accepted part of life. I never minded the smaller jobs for a younger child. One was taking care of the chickens, the feeding, watering, gathering eggs from the nests, cleaning the nests, the carrying in of the wood, hand pumping water from the well, keeping the stove reservoirs filled, and the cleaning and filling of the kerosene lamps. Used a newspaper for that lamp shade, and you had to be very careful that you didn't break it. School was a pleasure for me. I attended Sevastopol School for 12 years. I saw my teachers as knowledgeable adults, and I wasn't. I looked up to them with respect. They were leaders, and I felt I was there to learn from them. And we had a teacher, Mrs. Miller, in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade. And before we started the class in the morning, we had a 15-minute session. She would write something on the board like, honesty is the best policy. And then we discussed that for 15 minutes, so we had a good start for the day. And the best part of the school was access to the small library. I read every book I could get my hands on during the school year. I remember reading my favorites over and over, and in 3rd grade, I was recognized for reading 100 books, a star for every one. Though we had no books at home, we did get a newspaper, the Milwaukee Journal. In spite of the fact my dad only attended school until the 3rd day, he loved that newspaper. Excuse me. We had a country store 1 mile away, was the Joe Strand store at Institute. Many times I walked a half a mile of gravel road and a half a mile of the Highway 57 to Institute to get my mother a nickel's worth of yeast to make bread. Other items that were bought were the flour, sugar, and coffee, and not much else. After all, we had our own meat, beef from the cows, pork, ham, and bacon. Every farmer had a lot of pigs, milk and eggs and vegetables from the garden. Everyone's wardrobe was minimalistic. As a child, I had 1 pair of shoes for the school year and barefoot for the summer. It wasn't hard to pick what dress to wear when it was natural to pick the clean one. Brown cotton stockings in cooler weather, held up with a garter belt, maybe a sweater, and a wool jacket for winter. A pair of galoshes, rubber boots, to wear over shoes in the winter. And that is why the closets in the old houses were very small. You didn't have much to put in them. Where was I? Okay, in the summertime, cotton blouses and a pair of overalls were worn, which was very cool to wear, cool weather-wise. It was a time when no one had health insurance. Doctors would come to your house if really needed. Otherwise, there was Vaseline for cuts and bruises. And I remember one time when I had cancer sores in my mouth, my dad took me to see the doctor, who was Dr. Mulhauser from a long time ago, and he checked me out and he prescribed vitamin B1. And then my dad said, "How much, Doc?" And Dr. Mulhauser said, 50 cents. My dad paid him, and the doctor put it in his pocket. No secretary, no bookwork. How simple. No paperwork. Food was very basic. Breakfast, oatmeal with a hunk of sausage, sometimes pancakes, sometimes eggs and fried potatoes, and of course, bacon. Milk was a beverage for kids. Adults had coffee. Dinner was at noon. Meat was the main item. Beef roast, pork roast, chops, potatoes, always potatoes, boiled and sometimes mashed, gravy, of course, vegetables in season from the garden, Bread was served at every meal, and lots of home churned butter, which I had turned the churn, and then you turned it this way. Have you ever had a slice of fresh bread from the oven with lots of butter and topped with brown sugar? What a treat. There was also soup with homemade noodles. My mother would roll out the dough till it was very thin and then hang them over the back of the chair to dry. She made cakes and pies. At times there wasn't as much, but no one went hungry. On Monday, which was wash day, we always had boiled navy beans with pork hocks served with potatoes and sauerkraut. Of course, German people had a lot of sauerkraut. Supper was an evening meal, whatever was left over from dinner or a hunk of bread and sausage. There was no box food or processed food, no cereal boxes because we really didn't have cereal until the war years, Second World War. Nothing out of a can. We carried our lunch to school. Early days, it was in a syrup pail that had a handle. We made use of what was available. There were days when not much food was available, and that's when homemade bread had lard on it. Lard sandwiches. The lard was bacon grease with bits of brown in it. Have you ever fried bacon and dipped a piece of bread in it? Not bad. And to think I never complained what was in the bucket. When you are really hungry, just about anything tastes good. It would never pass in today's world with today's kids. Town was 7 miles away, and usually we would go once a week. Church was 4 miles away. It was St. John's Lutheran Church at Valmy. And I remember going to Sunday school and learning the Bible stories. As a small child, I would kneel by my bed to say my prayers. The wood floor was a bit hard. Many nights, my mother would tell me stories. Many were from the grim fairy tales, as I found out later. If there were no books, there was always a good memory of storytelling to pass on. Not read me a book, but tell me a story. For Christmas, I would receive a doll once in a while. There weren't many presents. We had a Christmas tree every year until I was 12. That fall, my brother, who was 15 years old, was killed in a farm accident. It was a sorrowful time, especially with my older brother, who was gone to the Second World War. There was no such thing as a birthday party when I was growing up. In fact, I had my first birthday party when I reached the age of 70. I really can't say I ever missed them. However, my aunt in Chicago, who was my baptismal sponsor, would send me $1 each year. I didn't always get to keep it, as one year it went to buy a bag of flour. That way all my family could benefit from it. I find lessons I learned as a child more or less stay with you all your life. They are the basic part of who you are. I still enjoy the same things I did when I was a child. I was very blessed to have parents and family who cared for me. I can't say I ever felt neglected or deprived. I learned to be accepting of present circumstances. My parents never said the words, "I love you," and there was never a moment when I ever doubted their love. It was shown by their words and actions. It was just understood. It seems when you are a child for a long period of time. It is just the rest of life that disappears into time. And in spite of my hard times as a child, I survived, and I feel I'm all the better for it. And I had a couple other little things I thought of later. Nowadays, many people have no qualms about taking help or a handout from the government. The last thing most farmers during the Depression would do was to apply for relief, as it was then called. That would have been a strike against their pride. The fact that they couldn't provide for their families. They knew who was taking government relief in the neighborhood, and they prayed they would never have to stoop that low. I was 11 when my brother Ray, who was 11 years older than me, was drafted into the Second World War. My dad had served in World War I, so he probably had the strongest feelings to part with his oldest child, for God knew how long. I'm sure my mother felt desperately sad also. As it turned out, it was over 3 years. He served in the Pacific area, and they most likely wondered if they ever would see him again. Ray was wounded twice and received the Purple Heart. As it was, he only lived to be 51 due to after effects of malaria while he was in that area. I had a brother, Elroy, who was killed in a farm accident in 1943. He was only 15. The Army wouldn't allow my brother Ray to come back for the funeral. Most likely the battles on the islands that were being fought were in full swing. I don't think my parents ever were the same after this. It was a time of terrible sorrow. After my brother died, the next person had to step up, and that was me. I helped to feed the calves and so on. The following summer, as I turned 13, I took a new job. How many of you ever had to learn to drive a team of horses? Someone had to do it. We were getting in the hay, and that was me to help. This setup included the team of horses, the wagon, and the hay loader was the third thing. The hay loader was a machine that picked up the hay and rolled it to the top of the wagon. Then the farmer forked it to the front of the wagon until it was loaded. There was a hay rack on the front of the wagon, and as the load of hay grew, the driver had to climb this rack up like a ladder. That was also me. It was the first time I ever had a job like this, and I was plenty scared. My dad encouraged me, and that helped. I don't think I ever had this on a job resume. I also drove the horses on the ropes that regulated the hay fork up when you put the hay away in the barn. I had to drive down the hill with the horses to carry the fork load up to the tracks on top of the inside of the barn, and then the rope was tripped, and had to take the horses and bring them back up the hill while handling the thick ropes. I have one more thing here. It's going pretty fast. When I was in 5th grade at the age of 10, in the spring of the year, I contracted a scarlet fever. This contagious disease was promptly given a quarantine, probably from the health department. No one could come on our property, and no one could leave. Messages were left in the mailbox as to groceries needed, etc. The hardest part was that my dad could not ship any milk. It all had to be dumped. This lasted for a matter of weeks. I think it was about 5 weeks. That meant no income for over a month. None of my siblings could go to school, and I spent most of the time confined to bed. Time passed very slowly. I had a mild case, so hopefully no after effects were had. It probably could have been very different, but penicillin hadn't been invented, and it was not a pleasant time for my family, I'm sure. Hardships came regularly. So that's about, when you write it, it takes a long time. When you read it, it goes fast. My name is Margaret Gilbert, and this is from an article I wrote in 2003, and the date today is September 19th, 2019. This is my neighborhood. I grew up a mile from here on Country View Road, and after I married, I lived on County T, and now I live on Country View, a mile and a half from where I grew up and a mile and a half from where we farmed. So I'm right in the middle. The name of the article is Life on the Farm in the 1930s and the 1940s. Farming, it is all around us, and it takes many shapes and forms and twists and turns. It affects our lives in many ways. A good share of people have some connection to an agricultural background. For me, farming has been in my life for as long as I can remember, for generations back, and most likely for generations to come. The memories come rushing back. Growing up with wooded acres to roam, and roam I did, freshly cut hay fields and grain fields to run across with bare feet as fast as I could so as not to feel the stubble, lying on my back in the hayfield listening to the birds flying over me as I was warmed by the sun, the wind tossing the hay back and forth. Of the 7 farms on our end of South Country View Road, 2.5 miles long, that were active in my youth, not one is still an operating, working farm. Most of the land is still farmed. Some of it has reverted back to brush and woods. When I was growing up, every resident in the country lived on a farm. It was a definite way of life. Having come through the Depression, it took a lot just to hang on to a farm and to feed the family. It was more of a means of survival than a business, which it is today. Also, in order to survive, farmers had all the worry of getting chores done daily, crops planted and harvested, dealing with horses and harnesses and simple machinery, and keeping it in constant repair. In the morning, come rain or shine, storm or the bitter cold of winter, animals had to be cared for. Even in the course of time, if a son had to go to war or death occurred in the family, cows had to be milked and fed. Sometimes a cow would bloat, and the farmer became a veterinarian and stuck a knife in one of her stomachs to release the gas. I saw my dad do that a few times. Sometimes the veterinarian was called, and the bill was hard to pay. Our well-liked veterinarian often lowered the monthly bill so the farmers had an easier time to pay. Old Doc Humpke figured that at least he would get some payment. Can you see any veterinarian doing that today? We have often enjoyed telling that true story to our present veterinarians that come to our farm. One time near Christmas, Dr. Humpke, the veterinarian, took me to town and let me pick out a doll that he paid for. The doll was especially cherished, and so was the veterinarian. Gift giving was on the light side for holidays. A couple things were all that were expected for Christmas, but the tree was decorated and the church service was an inspiring event. The children had pieces to speak in front of the church. I don't remember my parents getting any presents. We children thought the presents were for us. Summer was endless, or so it seemed. Besides our daily chores, we had time to play. My favorite thing was to roam through and explore the woods. A creek ran through our farm. That was Lily Bay Creek. In summer it would dry up, but the big mud hole in the middle of the woods lasted somewhat longer. It was fun to walk through the gushy mud and to study the insects. As a child, it seemed I was always watching cows or taking them to pasture. One pasture was down the dry creek bed, through the woods, and up Highway 57, south of Institute. The cows grazed both sides of the road. In the late 30s, there weren't many cars, and they weren't going very fast. My dog Shep, who was a large, beautiful border collie, would bring the cows up from the rear while I went ahead to stop the cows at the gate. Watching cows meant to guard them in an area that wasn't completely fenced in. That was a boring job for a young girl. My dad would tell me how lucky I was. I imagine a time to relax looked good to a busy, hard-working farmer. Another job I had was to carry in wood. When I came home from school, our big black cook stove needed regular stoking. The reservoir needed to be kept full of water, which meant getting water in from the outside well. Many pails of water had to be carried in. There was no need for any outside exercise programs for farm kids. Tractors were hard to come by, and most farmers had their horses for farm work. My dad used to break in horses for a man we all knew as Oscar the Horseman. Part of the payment for that job was a pony we were furnished. That was fun part for my older brother, who especially loved horses, and for me. One day I remember was Mickey, our Shetland pony. He didn't have the nicest disposition, and he would rather be in the barn eating hay instead of being ridden. One day after saddling him up and riding him a short distance, he decided he wanted to return to the barn. He turned abruptly and threw me out of the saddle. Only my foot was caught in the stirrup and I was dragged along. Luckily, my dad was nearby and finally stopped the pony and carried me into the house. No bones were broken, just a lot of scrapes. Mickey wasn't around very long after that. A quite formidable task for women on the farm was wash day. First, there had to be enough wood hauled into the wood box, making sure the wood stove was burning fiercely. Then, by pumping water at the well and carrying in buckets of it, the copper boiler was filled. The homemade lye soap was grated in, and the white clothes were boiled. In the summertime, the heat in the farm kitchen made it unbearable. That is why most farmsteads included a summer kitchen. Later on, we had a Maytag wash machine, but earlier, my mother used a scrub board that was hard on the knuckles. No wonder women had arthritic fingers as they aged. Clothes were put through a hand wringer, then rinsed, then put through the hand wringer again. I remember having to turn the crank on the wringer. One time, I even got my finger caught in the gears. After that, I was more careful. Clothes were hung on the line outside, or even spread on the bushes. That was in the summertime. In the winter, clothes that hung outside on the lines froze and later were brought in the house to finish drying that the wind and the cold couldn't do. Evenings after chores were done, My dad would come into the house to rest and read the newspaper. We could ill afford the paper, but had no radio until later on, so it was important to keep up with world events. My dad would sit in the rocking chair and put up his feet. I would love to untie his shoes and remove them. Then he would read his newspaper and I would brush his hair. He enjoyed that, and so did I. I got to hear him read the news of the day and to spend some personal time with my dad. Other times he would come into the house and say, "Ma, who should we visit tonight?" Being a German-speaking person, he couldn't say the V very well, and off we would go to one of our neighbors and enjoy each other's company. If there were no children our age to play with, we could sit and listen to the adults talk, and then the reward. A treat was served before we went home. That was really appreciated back then. So we all sat at their kitchen table and had a piece of cake or pie. Nothing ever was bought. Those are a few of my memories of farm life. Today it is much changed on the farm, of course. Dairy farms are shut down every day across the country. That endearing symbol of Americana is lamented by those of us born and raised on these farms. Instead of the familiar named cows that I help bring home to be milked, the cattle on our dairy farms today are housed in long barns. They enjoy resting on the mattresses in stalls where they are free to come or go. Huge fans at the ends of the barns draw in fresh air, and misters cool the cows in the summer. Cattle are grouped and fed balanced rations. Milk output per cow has been highly increased over the years. My sons and grandsons who operate our farm must use high technology and cutting-edge research. So efficiency is the name of the game these days to survive. A farmer must be much more than a tractor driver or a milker. After many generations of farmers on both sides of our families, we continue to farm. The constant work is balanced by the love of the land, enjoying nature, the turn of the seasons, working with and constantly watching the weather, and the love of farm life. That part never leaves us. It is what we do best and who we are and why we are proud to be called farmers. And that's the end of part one. Farm life during Depression years. And this was written as a second part in another edition of the Peninsula. It is very early in the morning. The eastern sky is beginning to show signs of dawn's light. The stars are still faint in the heavens, and it is time to get up and get going. Lots to do on the farm today. No alarm clock is needed, as a farmer is a creature of habit. Shep, go fetch the cows, and the precious farm dog does his job. The cattle are kept in a nearby night pasture, and Shep loves his work also. First things first, and it is milking time. May not need that lantern if it's too dark. May need that lantern if it is too dark in the barn. No electricity and no electric bill to pay, just the price of kerosene. While the farmer hand milks, he has time to think, time to figure out how the day may go, unfold, and what the workload will be. Things are stirring in the house also. There is plenty for the housewife to do. Always, there is the urge for accomplishment. The fire has to be laid in the black cook stove. There was a warming closet above and a reservoir on the side containing warm water from previous firings. The oven was deep and dark. Shiny silvery metal dressed it up here and there. It was my job to keep the reservoir filled with fresh water from the outdoor pump. I had to carry armfuls of wood after school each day. I must admit, I tried to get as much wood in an armful as I could. If there wasn't kindling chop, I knew how to use an axe. Work on the farm was not to be questioned or even complained about. It was an accepted fact of life for the children. Each did their part, so maybe I'd rather be reading a scarce book I could latch onto, but work came first and you just did it. So perhaps today was the day the thrashing machine was coming. Nothing could be more exciting. While we waited, we listened for the first sounds of it approaching. The countryside was so quiet. Other than the sounds of the cows or the chickens or the wind blowing, sound could travel quite a distance. Hardly a car was seen or heard. When the thrashing machine was sighted, a shout would go up. Much had to be done before thrashing began. Days before, it was planned which neighboring farmer would come with a team and wagon, who would just bring a fork to load the wagons with bundles of grain, or come to carry the bags of grain up to the granary. It was a day of hard work and sweat and dust and noise, but no lack of camaraderie and laughter. It was an immense job to feed the men and the thrashing crew. There were 2 huge meals plus 2 lunches. Large amounts of potatoes, meat, and vegetables were served, plus pies and cakes, and of course, fresh bread. My parents went all out to serve a lavish bread. Must have been a little neighborly competition. Although Depression years were long ago, they did exist. They were hard and difficult years. We managed to live through them, and it was never very easy. There were few creature comforts, and everything was a struggle. Every farm had to be self-sufficient to some degree. It was a matter of working for survival. We did have our fresh milk every day. We churned butter. We raised pigs for meat, plus a cow that could be spared for beef. And we had chickens, both for eggs and for meat. The garden was a lifesaver, and much canning was done. Even meat was canned. We only purchased items such as flour, sugar, or coffee, and not much more. Much mending was done on socks as well as on clothes. Good work habits were established. We had our fun times and found pleasure in small things. These things make up my fond memories. In the evening, my older brother and I would sit at the kitchen table drawing pictures on our nickel tablets, 5-cent tablets. He could draw the most beautiful horses, and I would try to copy him, even though I didn't always succeed at that. The kerosene lamp would cast soft shadows as we passed the evening away. Going up in the haymow on a rainy day, just nestling in the loose hay, and listening to the patter of rain on the barn roof was a simple pleasure. It was a good place to read a comic book and take a kitten along for company. These and many other memories are imprinted on my mind, signifying a more simple but just as happy a time as could be. Even though every day was a bit of a hardship for my parents, I feel it was a great time to grow up in, and I have many fond memories as I look back. I think the hard times made us to be grateful for what we are and have today. The end.